Budget 2018 will be a fine balancing act for Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, with the twin challenges of stimulating growth while sticking to fiscal discipline targets. It's also a challenge on the perception front. Remember, this will be the last full budget the Modi government presents before general elections in March next year. The budget comes at a time when the economy is recovering from demonetization and still getting used to GST. 2 years of bumper crops has not seemed to ease rural distress, and though there are no clear statistics on jobs available, there is a general perception that more jobs need to be produced quickly. Now, all of these long-term goals would be difficult to achieve with a few announcements in this budget, but surely a roadmap can be set with clearer targets. This whole week on Primetime Debate, we will be looking at Budget 2018 from various angles, representing the needs of various stakeholders. But today we begin with asking if Budget 2018 will enable a return to confidence, and will it be populist or pragmatic? Speaking on the show this evening are M. Govinda Rao, former member of the PMEAC, KV Subramanian, Associate Professor of Finance at the Indian School of Business, political commentator Sheshadari Chari, who's with the BJP, and Congress spokesperson Salman Soz. Welcome all, and thank you for speaking with us this evening on Bloomberg Quint. I'm going to start with Mr. Govinda Rao and Mr. Subramanian, because earlier this week, earlier this month, they had met with Prime Minister Modi when he met with economists for about 4 hours and asked them what they think should be done to fix the economy. So, Mr. Subramanian, why don't I start with you? What did you tell the Prime Minister in that meeting? I'm told I don't have Mr. Subramanian, so I'll start with Mr. Govinda Rao. Mr. Rao, what did you tell the Prime Minister in that meeting, and what do you think should be the priority in this budget?
Hello?
Well, the meeting was held from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. With the Prime Minister. This was on the 10th of January. There were few groups that were formed, and I was in the group which basically discussed the macro balances. So the important, basically the issues which are fiscal, and again, this is not supposed to be necessarily for this particular budget, but it's basically a policy orientation for the coming year. All policies need not be done in the budget, number one. Number two, in fact, quite a lot of the thing on the fiscal side has to be done at the state level, and the union budget cannot be taken as representing everything. However, union budget does give a certain policy direction. Union budget also gives policy signals. And therefore, what we talked about in the fiscal balances, in the macro balances group, was that, first of all, we need to really stick to the fiscal deficit target, because there has been so much of a slippage over the years. In fact, we should have reached the 3% of GDP fiscal deficit in 2008-9. And successive governments have not been able to tame the fiscal deficit. That's the first thing. The second important thing is that, over a period of time, the credibility of the budget itself, budget itself is getting lost. Because the forecasting, goes awry. When the revenues are, sort of overestimated, it affects not only the union budget, but also the state budgets, because 42% of the divisible pool goes to the states. And therefore, it is important to restore the credibility of the budget, which basically said, we said that the 14th Finance Commission, of which I was a member, had made a recommendation that we should have a fiscal council, which would basically, sort of evaluate the budget, monitor the union government, and then also cost the various policy pronouncements made from time to time by the government. Nobody does the cost. People make the policies, and this has been the practice with all the governments. And so you need to cost them properly. And in order to do all this, there should be an independent fiscal council appointed by the parliament and reporting to the parliament. This was one of the things that was said. And we also said that reviving the investment climate is very important.
Yes.
In order to be able to do that, what the government should do is, number one, it should, fulfill the promise made in 2015-16 budget that they will rationalize the tax preferences, exemptions and tax concessions and then reduce the corporate tax to 25%. Number two, in fact, the tax policy should be focusing on revenue generation and not too many objectives. And there is no reason why the tax policy should be discriminating between the debt-based, mutual fund instruments and, equity-based instruments. It should be neutral between various financial assets. And in order to be able to, so we did say that it should really rework on the long-term capital gains tax. And when you do that, when you apply that to the equity side, I mean, there is no reason why you should have a security transaction tax. So you have, both security transaction tax and commodity transaction tax increase the transaction cost of the economy, and possibly they should go. And there, so these are some of the major things that we had mentioned.
Okay.
And of course, we also said that employment, the subsidy should be rationalized. There is no point in having fertilizer subsidy going on. And then, and as far as the banking system is concerned, I think PJ Nayak committee report should be implemented, just as you are doing a lot of recapitalization, spending a lot of money on that. You need to really also undertake governance reform on the lines that was indicated in the PJ Nayak committee report.
All right. Mr. Govinda Rao, you've laid out literally the broad expectations that most people have from the budget this year in a very succinct way. I'm going to come to Mr. Subramanian on a specific question on the banking sector. We've seen the IBC, sort of being implemented this year. We're still working out how efficient that system is. But what do you think should be done in terms of more banking reforms for that sector in the budget this year?
So, Mr. Govinda Rao already alluded to, the recommendations that our group made to the Prime Minister on the banking sector. What is important to actually remember here is that the spirit of the PJ Nayak committee recommendations, of which I was the member and the director of research, the spirit is about governance changes. Actually, the IBC is essentially a cure, but the PJ Nayak committee is talking about prevention. And there is therefore a significant difference in emphasis on, where the correction needs to be made. For instance, if you look at the public sector banks are, not corporations under the company law. Public sector banks are still, they're basically relics of the Banking Regulation Act of 1949 and the Bank Nationalization Acts of the late 1960s and 70s. Which basically had hard-coded a lot of the governance for banks itself. So, I mean, these are severely anachronistic that needs to be, done away with. Second, what is quite important to keep in mind is actually, while we definitely generally talk about political sort of interference, which used to be there in the previous government, this government seems to have done away with. But the bureaucratic influence that permeates the public sector banks is something that continues. And one of the key aspects that the Nayak committee had mentioned was that you want experts to be guiding banks, actually, not generalists. And that's the second recommendation. Therefore, the creation of the bank holding company, which creates an arm's length between the government, in particular the bureaucrats, and the the bankers. That's the second thing. And third, actually, in terms of aspects like the vigilance function, which really, sort of encumbers the public sector banks a lot. In general, if you look at the way the government sort of, creates severe hurdles for the public sector banks to compete with the private sector banks, and the spirit of the recommendation was to ensure that many of the obstacles that are put actually are removed, and many of these are governance. And the emphasis on governance is important because, some critics, for instance, point out that, the public sector banks were doing really well till 2008, 2009. The fact is that governance problems surface only when the economy is not doing well. It is like when the tide goes out, only then do you actually get to see who is, who's swimming with clothes and who's not. And so the governance problems actually have come to the fore because of the economy not doing well. So just to add, one more aspect, which is apart from the banking sector itself, what is also important to keep in mind is the stress in the corporate sector itself.
Yes.
And that is something which actually is investment is being held back, not only because of the banking sector, banks being under duress, but also because of the over leveraging and thereby the significant amount of debt that the private sector is sitting on, which the private sector needs to move actually to ensure that they offload and sell assets. And that's something that the government will have to sort of push together with the Reserve Bank.
Before I come to Sheshadari Chari and Salman Soz, I just want to go through a couple of things that have emerged, in the Davos summit, which is going on right now. One is where India stands in the Inclusive Development Index at 62, behind China and Pakistan. There's also an Oxfam report out which says that the richest 1% in India owns 73% of the wealth generated. And I want to come to you first, Sheshadari Chari, with the context that this is the last full budget before the big general elections in 2019. This is around the time people are going to start asking, have the Achhe Din come? Where are the Achhe Din? And how is this budget going to at least bring about the perception that Achhe Din are here, if not very close?
Modi government, if you see, has made certain very important deviations from the past. Number one, budget from 2014 is no longer used as a political tool. Budgets are made in a very professional manner, and they are just looked at as an instrument for social change. So, and another thing that has happened since 2014 is not using budget as a populist vote-catching machinery. And if you see, Modi was able to take two very major decisions, both very bold decisions. One was the demonetization and another was GST. So, given this background, and given the background that Modi, Prime Minister himself has said that I don't expect this budget to be a populist one. So considering these aspects, I think this budget will actually earmark the roadmap for consolidating growth and also increasing industrial production. If you see the Q3 figures of more than 100 industries, the situation seems to be slightly improving. Some of them have registered operating profits, and the raw material input cost of these 100 companies have gone up by 12.5%, which means more raw material has gone into production, which means the Q4 will actually give out production facilities also, production numbers also, and this which also means that demand is picking up. If demand is picking up, that also goes to say that the effect of GST and demonetization has weakened. There were no doubt they were disruptive, and to some extent they had a dampening effect in the beginning, but that effect is being weaned out. So therefore I see this budget as a step ahead of GST and demonetization, and it will be able to consolidate. But of course, having said this, there are certain areas which need special attention, like education, rural infrastructure, agriculture, and water management. And these are some of the areas which will have to be given more importance, and these are the areas which impact the social sector also. So from 100% industrial sector and corporate budget, we will have to move towards social sector budget.
No, so I mean, I don't know if every budget has been only a corporate budget. The mandate of the budget is to look at every aspect of the economy and every section of Indian society. But Salman Soz, I want to come to you with a key question of, as an opposition party, as a constructive opposition party, as the Congress claims to be, what do you hope to see from the budget? Where should the focus be?
Well, first, let's take a step back because we can't talk about things in a vacuum. The Prime Minister is in Davos right now, and if you think about what's been happening in the global economy over the last couple of years, you will observe that the rest of the world was growing, and at the time that the rest of the world was growing, when oil prices were very, very low, we were supposed to get a big boost. We did, but at the same time, India was one of those emerging market economies that was actually slowing down exactly at the wrong time. And who did it? It was the Prime Minister. What Mr. Chari calls a reform, as in demonetization, economists call it voodoo economics. And that is what the Prime Minister inflicted on the country and millions of people, especially the poor and low-income families in India. So, obviously that has implications, that has consequences. Then they rolled out the GST, which was supposed to be a great reform, but the way it was rolled out, of course, it has had a huge impact on the economy. And now you're in position where you will face some macro instability. Why? Because, it's hard to meet your fiscal deficit targets. But what the government is doing now is basically through a sham disinvestment process by which they sell HPCL to ONGC, collect 36,000 crore rupees. And of course, ONGC is also government controlled. They'll show that they met the fiscal deficit target. But, if you're a real kind of analyst, you know that it's a sham disinvestment. The government is not going to meet your fiscal deficit target. Crude prices are firming up. That is also going to weigh down on your, budgetary maneuver. So, I think the government is really going to be hamstrung. So I don't know how they're going to get the money that they need for some of the things that Mr. Chari was talking about, which I think are good things. I mean, I support those things. We need to focus a lot more on health and education in India. We also need to focus on the rural economy, because that is in a shambles. Now, we focus a lot on capitalism, and this is Bloomberg and Quint. Of course, Bloomberg Quint is one of the channels that talks a lot about capitalism. I talk about social, human capitalism. If we do not have human development in India, there can be no amount of development that you want. You can go to Davos and you can bring back all the people from there. I think there's a lot of focus on things like FDI. Oh, FDI, $60 billion, $40 billion. But foreign direct investment is less than 3% of your investments in this country. Why are we focusing so much on that and not domestic investors? Your investment ratio is right now close to 26%, down from 34% just a few years earlier. We have a serious issue. We need some headroom. I don't know where the headroom is going to come from, frankly. And I think I do hope that they focus on the banking sector. I do hope that they focus on trying to ride the investment cycle. I do hope they focus a lot more on health and education. If they do those kinds of things, the budget is not going to do that. But the government still has time over the next year to do some of these things.
All right, the budget can perhaps set a direction and a tone of things to come. But Mr. Subramanian, I just want to talk a bit about, what we expect from the budget in terms of the RBI Consumer Confidence Index from December 2017, which showed that there was a consistent drop in consumer confidence. There was a fear of reducing incomes. There was uncertainty on employment. There was a fear that the expenditures will increase even though incomes were reducing. So this was as of December 2017. One can assume it extends even now to Jan 2018. Improving the general mood and environment, is that one real clear message that you would hope comes out of this budget?
Yeah, actually, if you think about how the spirits of the economy will get improved, it has to happen with with job creation. There's some recent, pieces that have been written by a couple of researchers, which show that the job creation numbers actually are not looking as bad as they were, touted to be. And I think, job creation is indeed picking up. What the government, would actually do well to focus on is to accelerate exports, and in particular labor-intensive exports, because labor-intensive exports actually create, greater jobs than compared to, capital-intensive ones. So if the government can focus, given that the world economy is starting to look up, I think the opportunity is definitely there to actually accelerate exports, especially the labor-intensive ones, which will then create jobs. And when you create jobs, actually the disposable income at the bottom of the pyramid actually increases, and that is what will really sort of push up the spirits of people. So I think that is something which is quite important. Of course, I think also focusing on some of the agrarian distress is something that is important. You sort of preambled by saying that despite 2 good seasons of monsoon, that some of the outstanding issues, which I must admit, several governments have done nothing about actually, addressing some of the structural factors relating to agrarian distress. I think that should be attended to, because what that will also do is to put more money in the rural side of the of the domestic economy, and thereby also foster greater disposable income and therefore purchasing power.
Just a couple of points which I want to get Mr. Rao in on. One is the comment that Salman Soz made on the HPCL ONGC divestment and how that is going to hit the targets, because technically we will hit the targets, we will surpass the divestment targets. That would perhaps help towards keeping on track on fiscal deficit targets, which is something you spoke about, so that 3.2% figure will hopefully be kept. But you were also talking about the perception and credibility of budgets. In that context, how do you see the HPCL ONGC deal?
Well, there are lots of creative accounting that is being, done by successive governments. I mean, that's nothing new.
Yeah.
In fact, the previous government wanted all the idle money with the public sector enterprises to be, sort of given back to the finance ministry. These are the things, even in the past it has been done, it will continue to be done. And again, it is not the question of, 2 decimals in the fiscal deficit slippage. The issue is the overall credibility of the system. Now, I'll, very briefly return to the need to revive the, industrial climate in the economy. You see, there are, as Mr. Subramanian said, there are a number of things that the government will have to do. But I must say that the budget is not the only way we can do about it. Policies have to be undertaken throughout the year. And again, quite a lot of the things like health and education will have to come from the states. And even the agricultural, the thing. The union government can only make a certain amount of contribution through the, centrally sponsored schemes. Of course, the rationalization of fertilizer and food subsidy, stabilizing agrarian prices through significant investments in, in storage, processing, and marketing infrastructure. And trying to ensure that you have a stable prices and don't go back to the cobweb cycles as we have seen in the past. Reviving the industrial climate would also require, ultimately will depend upon how effectively your NCLT will function. The cases that have been referred to by the Reserve Bank of India to the NCLT, these will have to come through. And in fact, if you have a couple of them doing well and you are able to resolve them, then I think the confidence will be back. Please also do not forget that this year there is no pay increases, and then the public consumption will not go up substantially. So the investment has to come back, and a lot of labor reforms. Again, this is not something which you can do it in the budget, but then it is important to do the labor reforms if you want labor-intensive industrialization in this country.
Mr. Rao,
so a whole lot of policies will have to be.
Sure. In terms of labor reforms, very early on in the tenure of this government, that was sort of lobbed back to the states, saying that state governments will have to craft, their own rules. So labor and land are two areas which have not been touched as of yet. And I have minimal time, but I want to get closing comments from Sheshadari Chari and Salman Soz. So please.
That has not worked. The point is
I agree. It has not worked. I agree completely.
When China is moving up.
Just quick closing comments from Sheshadari Chari and Salman Soz.
And when the labor-intensive
to
things are
close the show,
available
and I just have a couple of minutes. Sheshadari Chari, you've talked about big picture, but what is the one area which, according to you, this government cannot afford to ignore? Just more insurance plans for the rural sector may not be enough.
No, I don't think mere tinkering with rural sector outlays will not work. There has to be a very serious and deep thinking as far as rural economy is concerned. As somebody very rightly said, the rural folks will have to have money in their hands. And if you put money in the pockets of the rural people, this is what in fact Deng Xiaoping said once, and this is exactly what one of the former finance ministers, who was actually not a finance minister by choice, Jaswant Singh said. So what is important is to increase the rural income. That will have to be done, and also something will have to be done on the personal income tax slabs.
Okay.
Merely increasing it from 2.5 to 3 lakhs is not enough. It will at least have to go to 5 lakhs.
All right, that's a good point there. I'm going to have to, I'm running out of time, but I just want to end with one last line to Salman Soz in all fairness. Mr. Soz, if you have to pick one sector which needs the most attention, what would that be? And please, brevity.
It's not a sector per se, but jobs. I know Mr. Subramanian talked about a study that claims that there's been great job creation. The Prime Minister talked about it. But that report has been debunked as well, because you take forced formalization and informal jobs become formal, and you say that that's an increase in jobs, whereas you would have lost millions of informal jobs. So what is the net? Those researchers have not actually talked about it. So I don't think job creation is going well. If the Prime Minister believes that, he's, I think, going to make a horrible mistake for himself and his party in 2019. I think they really need to focus. Clearly, they need to do something, maybe set up a Blue Ribbon Commission on how to create jobs. One final point about Mr. Chari. Please do not look at China all the time. China is structurally a very different economy than India is. If you use the same prescriptions as China has applied to its own self, you will lead India in the wrong direction. India is a very different country. Our solutions...
All right, we'll have to end it there, but thank you so much to all of you for joining in on the first of the pre-budget debates on Primetime Debates. We will be talking up ahead this week on agriculture, on jobs, and all the areas which we all look out for in Budget 2018. Hopefully, it will be a return to confidence.
Today, we kickstart our